Good morning. Oh my gosh, come on, good morning. I am uncaffeinated, so I am going to need some energy here. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's a story. So I guess before we go too far here, show of hands so I can get a little bit of a feel for the room. How many devs do we have in the crowd? So most of us, okay, as expected. How about maybe product managers? Let's see, QA, design, management. Anyone else want to shout out roles that I missed? DevOps? Just shout it out for me. I can't see hands too well. Okay. Who is still convinced that they should care about AI governance? Really? Huh, okay, cool. So I've been around the AI ethics space for some time, gosh, almost, I guess, closing in on 8 years. And back then, anytime you say the word ethics or risk or how things are going to go wrong in machine learning is what we talked about back then, most of the time people really didn't care. And I've really noticed a shift in the last year about interest in governance, about risk management, about AI ethics. And I talk about these things slightly interchangeably, and they're not, but they kind of lead into each other. And we're going to talk about that sort of linearly throughout this talk. When I started first writing this talk, I was studying for the International Association of Privacy Professionals, IAPP's AIGP, lots of acronyms, Artificial Intelligence Governance Professional exam. And so first I was actually just kind of going through the legal requirements. And as you might imagine, over the last couple of years, the legal landscape changes all the time. And I thought, well, this talk is kind of freaking pointless if I just try to always teach the laws at the time, because they're going to change tomorrow and the week after that. And so instead, I transitioned this talk into being more of a, let me try and teach you how I think in terms of a framework, in terms of both AI ethicist framework, and also then how do I take that and make decisions? How do I use that to manage risk? Speaking of risk management, I do that on a daily basis in my personal life. So this is not a secret. I also advocate whenever I can for disability rights, because I also have a disability. I have epilepsy, and usually I'm sometimes pretty good. Yesterday I had a little seizure, which also led to some internal bleeding, which led me to a hospital last night. And I am here, but if I sit down, that is risk management. And so if you see me sit down, please know I am not being rude. I'm just trying to make sure that we can all be here together, because I am so excited to be here with you. I truly love the dev community, being able to come speak at conferences. And for those of us with disabilities, it just means a little bit of risk management in our daily lives. And sometimes it's a little bit more active on some days than others. And that's what it is. So, oh. No. We won't cheers for that. What I will cheers for is your guys' health care, because I avoid hospitals like the plague in the States, because it usually costs me a few $1,000s. And I got the bill last night, and it was just under €200. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So I'm Michelle. I work at JetBrains. This slide's a little bit outdated. Unfortunately, we lost funding for the Center for Practical Bioethics, but I was also a tech advisor there. I also do some responsible AI consulting for several years. I'm a Microsoft MVP for Foundry now. We no longer have trustworthy AI, as well as Python. And then I did my master's degree in AI at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore in the US. So this is a quote that came out in the International AI Safety Report last year in 2025. And I think it's one of my favorite ones that I have heard thus far. It's, AI does not happen to us. Choices made by people will determine its future. A lot of times I hear people say, especially kind of on the doomsday side, or maybe fear of artificial superintelligence, ASI, or maybe even some kind of hyped up beliefs around if AGI is possible and what that will look like. And it feels like all of a sudden we're going to be in this world where we can't control AI, and AI has taken over us. And I've seen some really kind of wild ideas as to what that will look like. And I don't want to discredit us being mindful and fearful of that possibility, but those types of things are not going to happen overnight, right? We're not going to wake up suddenly in a world that's overrun by systems we can't control. Someone will have built those systems. Someone will have approved those systems. Other people will have used those systems. Consumers have more power than you would think, right? We're all consumers of these systems too, not just builders. And so I think that this is really important. We have to decide, not only as builders, not only as decision makers, but also as consumers, what is the world that we want to wake up in tomorrow when it comes to AI? I often get flagged as sort of your AI doomsday girly, and I really like to point out I'm actually not. I consider myself a pragmatic optimist. I would not have worked in this field for almost a decade if I did not believe in the power of AI. I believe in the power of machine learning. I think that we can cure very real problems. I'm working on some personal projects for me related to epilepsy where I'm like, yeah, this should be pretty easy to create something that can help me manage that risk. There's so many use cases that we can use AI for good, right? But there's a lot of ways that it can go wrong. And we have to understand all those different ways and the trade-offs that we'll have to make to balance the ledger. 31 minutes, let's see. Okay, I can tell you a little story. So I got an email, and it was kind of a wild story at the time. This was just over a year ago. And the more time passes, the more I actually think the story is relevant. It was late 2024. I was doing some consulting for that Center for Practical Bioethics, and we worked with a lot of local, I live in the Kansas City region in the States. We worked with a lot of healthcare organizations, and obviously do a lot of ethics related to AI in healthcare. And a reporter had reached out to my colleague and I asking to kind of comment on a campaign that had started. And so I get this story, and I'm like, oh my God, how did we not hear about this? And essentially what had happened, so fentanyl, is everyone familiar with fentanyl? Yeah, it's pretty prevalent in the US. It's very prevalent in my hometown. There's a lot of overdoses from this drug that gets mixed into other drugs, and a lot of young people think they're taking something, and anyways, they unfortunately pass away. And this local campaign that was trying to increase fentanyl awareness used, I believe it was character AI, to create the likenesses, video and voice likenesses of these young people who had passed away. And then they went and made a commercial of these people post-mortem advocating against, drug usage, against fentanyl, trying to promote fentanyl awareness. And this campaign went on local television. And so the reporter calls up and is like, hey, can we get an AI ethicist perspective? And I'm like, I don't think you need an AI ethicist on this one. I feel like you could probably go down the street and ask 10 people, and probably 7 of them are going to give you similar WTF did you guys just do opinions. And I don't generally like to tell people don't do this, because the answer is always it depends. What are you going to do? How are you going to do it? We were first told that these people were under the age of 18. They were minors. So for me, that was also a huge red flag. What was the parents' involvement? Because technically, they own any sort of data related to those minors, right? But if you start thinking about this, we later found out they were 19, meaning they were just beyond that age, and the parents still gave consent and gave that data. Legally, that's actually a little bit more questionable because the parents no longer had right to do that, right? There was no sort of mention in a will or an estate. What happens when I die? Who owns my face? Who owns my likeness? Who owns my voice? What can be done with the representation of me after I pass away? What could I advocate for that I didn't advocate for in my life? How much further can this go, right? So if you start drawing a line in the sand or you don't draw a line in the sand, like that line can get moved. And I think the more we see too in the last 6-8 months with the advent of different agenic systems, you start thinking about these things and my goodness, it can go deep. Now, this campaign was started with the best of intentions, and I recognize that. And I, applaud the campaign owners for trying to prevent senseless deaths. And we also have to look at the medium being used. So, governance is a framework, all right? But in order for a framework to be effective, we need to have decision points. So as we go through the presentation today, we're going to touch through some of these decision points, and I'm going to go through some of these pretty quickly because I'm a yapper, and I've got a shorter time than I normally do. But what we're going to do is start with ethics. Now, a lot of times when I say the word ethics, I see people's eyes glaze over, or maybe they leave the room. Sometimes if I'm going into a room full of C-suite members and I'm like, okay, let's talk about values and ethics, and immediately it's like, oof, eyes glaze over. Sometimes people care, and then I get really excited because I care. But when the eyes glaze over, I can be like, all right, how about lawsuits? Do you like lawsuits? Would you like to get sued? And they're like, wakes up, cool. Risk management. We're actually talking about the same thing. I'm going to change how I talk about it a little bit, but we're driving towards the same goal. We're driving towards the same destination. We're just taking different vehicles. So I'm going to hop in your vehicle, and we're going to drive there together. But truly what we're talking about is ethics. And ethics are subjective, by the way. If you take a problem like the trolley problem, and it depends on which school of ethical thought you ask, usually deriving from culture, everybody's going to give you a different answer depending on the nuances of their background, of the situation at hand. So it gets very interesting, I think, from an engineering perspective, too. How do we account for something like that? So the following few slides contain a lot of information. I'm going to glaze through them pretty quickly here. But what I want to kind of start getting you all to think about is how complex this landscape is. So a little over a year ago, I had people asking me questions like, okay, Michelle, but what about privacy? How does that fit into this? Well, what about fairness? How does that fit into this? And I was like, hey, this is all kind of under the same umbrella. They're just in different sections. So I tried to create a landscape. And I created 6 pillars. And it's 6 because I gave myself an arbitrary limit. And then because I gave myself an arbitrary limit, I ended up squeezing 2 into each pillar. And then in each of those, they have 5 subcategories because I gave myself a limit of 5 subcategories. We could go deeper. And I'm not going to read through all of these because there's 6 of them. But I kind of just want to start getting you guys to think about how much goes into this. Right? So I actually did quite a bit of research in grad school about bias, measurement, and mitigation in the field of fairness. So what I was mostly looking at was multi-objective optimization in machine learning, meaning if you're using imbalanced or unfair data, in order to increase fairness, you take a hit usually on performance or accuracy. So how do you find that Pareto front? How do you find that middle ground where you're not making a trade-off, a sacrifice in either objective, and you try and find that optimal middle ground? But fairness in AI basically is referring to the principle that AI systems should not reinforce, create or perpetuate discriminatory outcomes based off of sensitive factors. And of the subcategories, I listed algorithmic bias and discrimination, different types of fairness metrics and trade-offs, because how do you measure something like fairness? Well, to date, there's almost 30 mathematical definitions. So then how do you hand that off to a data scientist or even a developer and say, hey, go measure fairness in your product? Well, it really depends. That's a lot of different measurements to try and take, and then how do you decide which is the right one? Intersectionality, so that means like bias isn't usually measured on just one thing, right? So privilege occupies a lot of different ways if we want to think about it like that. Perhaps if we're looking at a data set that involves people, we might not just be thinking about a factor like race. It might also be in combination with gender or economic status. Like there's so many different things that group in together. So then how do you separate and measure these things? That's what we refer to as intersectionality in fairness. Then again, like your data representation and your collection. How did we collect our data set? How are we representing our study? And then how do we deploy and how do we measure the impact continuously? So the rest of these kind of slides, what you're going to see is it's very hard for you to see, but let's see how so the pink on the left is your subcategories, the green is the overviews. What I want you to think about is the three last columns, and the purple one is in the middle is ethical considerations. So this is what should we do here? What should we not do? The blue column, which is severely out of date, is legal considerations. What must we do? What must we not do? And then the orange, supposed to be yellow, orange column is what can we do? What can't we do? What are our technical constraints? And so if we start thinking about these things as we're trying to build different products, we start getting a framework in mind, and we can start making decisions. So then we start getting into transparency and explainability, basically referring to the degree of which AI systems, their decision-making processes, and the underlying data can be understood and interpreted by humans. So explainability and interpretability are kind of two sides of the same coin. So explainability, for reference, is the outside view. That's really important to our users, right? Interpretability is actually the inside view. What kind of mechanisms can we use to understand what actually happened inside the model, inside the agent, inside the system? And then transparency, like that's our obligations to the users. Do they understand why an output was reached? Do they even understand that they're interacting with an AI system? So of the core subcategories here, like our black box problem, the more complicated a model is, the harder it is for us to derive those explainability outcomes. And again, those explainability techniques, they're pretty difficult right now. It was way easier when we were dealing with machine learning, kind of simple decision trees. The right to explanation, EU AI Act, there's a lot of that. We'll talk a little bit about the laws here shortly. Human AI interaction, and then what are those interpretability standards and auditing? If something goes wrong, do you as a developer actually know how to get into your system and pinpoint where it went wrong? Can you trace that? Human impact and societal well-being. I'm of the opinion that I think the next 5 to 10 years are going to be absolutely fascinating in this field, and I don't really think that what we're looking at is going to be necessarily the ever-going progress of the technology itself. I think we're actually going to be looking at its impact on human psychology. How humans that get isolated with this technology could get tricked or deceived by anthropomorphic design. I think that is going to be an area to watch. If I was a psychologist, I would be looking to see where I can get involved right now. of these categories. So employment, right? How does this impact employment? How is it going to impact labor across different fields? Obviously, in development, that's a big question for us and all of the agentic coding systems, right, that are on the market. How does that change our job? Accessibility. How do we design AI for everyone? How do we make sure that we're not perpetuating things like ableism? Mental health, right? How do we protect people that are using these systems? How can we make sure that it's still for social good? Autonomy and human decision making, and again, social good. Security and safety. Security is becoming really interesting right now in AI governance. I think there's a lot of fields that used to be separated that in the last 3 months are starting to merge. We're talking kind of synonymously about observability and about cybersecurity, about security in general, about safety and governance and ethics, and they're starting to merge into a bubble, which I think is great. I also think some of the agentic systems we'll talk about later are making governance a little bit more clear, because we're moving from these big models that do everything to kind of role-defined agent systems. And we can put boxes around those and say, oh, this one went outside its box. Let's target that. Privacy and data protection. We don't want to leak anything. We want to make sure that there's informed consent. Sometimes it gets interesting, like things I've seen where companies are perhaps using AI-driven photo tools, maybe to enhance photos for marketing materials without actually reaching out to the people to make sure that's okay. Hey, guess what? That's biometric data. A lot of people don't realize that when they're interacting with these systems. Differential privacy, surveillance and facial recognition, data security and storage, user control. These are becoming very, very important topics right now in MAS, multi-agenic systems. And then again, accountability and governance, right? Who's responsible? Who's liable? What kind of regulatory frameworks do we have? How do they continuously adapt as the systems adapt and change? How do we audit? How do we make sure that we're incorporating human-centered design? And what do corporations do to keep up? How do we make sure that, we're able to monitor for things like shadow AI? So you will notice that there's a lot of things missing in those pillars. We could sit here all day in a workshop and talk about AI ethics and all the different aspects. I didn't mention anything of what I'll call emerging risk factors. And some are more immediate than others. Things like synthetic media and deep fakes, things like the global power shift, right, where we have geopolitics kind of pressing up against this technology and making a lot of pressing needs and changes. I'm not going to get into consciousness debates with you here or catastrophic or existential failures. I'm worried about the stuff that's been around since tomorrow and last year and 10 years before that, not the hypotheticals of next week. But something that you need to know is that AI ethics are really complicated because human ethics are complicated. There's not a right answer, okay? There's, to every issue, there's a valid argument on each side. And in AI, we call this the value alignment problem. Sometimes these things pull up in tension against each other. Things like privacy versus security, right? Like on the facial recognition argument, you might say, well, if we surveil and use facial recognition on everybody coming in and out of a certain building, we're making sure that the building is secure. But on the other side of that, we know that AI systems have bias against different groups of people. And then there's a privacy issue too. So how do you pick that middle ground? So our job in AI ethics is basically risk management and helping enable decisions in complicated situations, right? We're wanting to help align all these conflicting priorities to help make the decisions, and from those decisions derive features and metrics of how do we measure their success or lack thereof. If you want an amazing book to read about responsible AI, about value alignment, Responsible AI by Olivia Gamblin came out a few years ago. She's been consulting in this space for years. And And she's really great at walking through kind of how do you talk about values? How do you as an organization decide what your values are? How do you map them to the values in your industry and your requirements in your industry, the requirements in your governing body that you live in, the governing body of your users? You can also go to her website and download this thing called the Values Canvas. And basically what she does here is she goes through mapping of people, which she calls the root of responsible AI, process, the structural support, and then technology, which is the best practices. And it's super helpful. If you need a place to start with just thinking about this, I highly recommend this book. It's great for organizations and for individuals. So a lot of things have changed in the last 6 months, right? Agentic systems are everywhere. Spoiler alert, agentic systems have been around since the 90s, but they're everywhere now, right? What's changed? In some ways, not a ton. In other ways, everything. Previous product conversations, mostly we were talking about recommendation systems, right? We were talking about summaries, chatbots, classifications, content generations, these types of things. And I would say that they were kind of more linear in terms of risk, right? In terms of how do we measure, there's a clear input and an output. But now we're building these systems that pursue goals across multiple steps. They call external tools and APIs. They use memory or context. They interact with different amounts of private information. They make or recommend decisions. They trigger downstream actions or even trigger downstream systems. Right? And then they operate in some cases with partial human oversight. I'm going to say in some cases because for the most part, I'm seeing a trend of what I'll call like agent washing. People are like, oh, we've got this agentic system, but actually your chatbot has more agency than the system that they said is actually agentic. So always take it with a word of warning when someone uses the latest buzzword. But basically what this means for us is that the governance question is no longer just, did the model produce a good answer? It's now, what can the system do? Who gave it permission? How do we know that it stayed within its bounds? And then who's accountable for when the workflow goes wrong? So basically what we've done is we've changed the risk surface. Agentic or multi-agentic systems, MAS, it introduces new governance risks. Maybe new is a strong word here, but I would say more complicated, more layered, right? So autonomy. Also, you have to measure autonomy, and I like to do that. If you're actually looking at an agentic system, make a definition for autonomy or agency and see how much it actually has. Compare it to something else, put it on a linear map because I bet that it has less than you think it did. But you need to know that. You need to understand what actions can be taken without approval. What kind of tool access does it have? What systems, APIs, files, or permissions can it use? What about drift? Goal drift. Does it have the ability to optimize for the wrong thing? Observability is so important in this space. Metrics, logging, right? Are we able to reconstruct what happened? Do we have a place that we can go in and read the logs and the metrics and truly understand at time X, this thing kicked off and then it went over here and oh, this is where the error occurred? Human oversight. Where should that human in the loop process occur? Where should a human get to interrupt, or to review? And from an accountability perspective, like, who owns this? Who's liable? I think that we're about to see a lot of changes in terms of liability in some of these cases, because it might not just be the model provider anymore. If you're building an entire system that says, oh, we guarantee that when it comes to you, we've done all this work in the middle. Legal teams are going to have some fun in the next few years. So the model is now just one part of the system. In agentic AI, the real governance unit is the workflow. It's the models, right? It's the tools, it's the permissions that it has, it's the memory, it's the data, it's the UI, it's the humans that are involved with it, it's the logging, it's the escalation paths. It's an architecture system. So this should look kind of familiar to us. In some ways, we're going back to what we have known. And a lot of what we're looking at should sound so familiar to you because it's what you've been doing your entire career. Your job has always been knowing what can go wrong in my system and what have I done to account for that path. It's the same thing here. In some cases, the modularity of multi-agenic systems is going to make this slightly easier. So I'm not too concerned as long as we're doing the work. So now I'm going to talk fast. What's our current regulatory landscape look like? So I am not going to go and teach you how to become lawyers because this is going to change tomorrow. But I'm going to give you like a very quick run through of what's going on in the space. You don't have to become lawyers. In fact, your AI models can probably tell you more accurate laws than your legal team can respond to you in an email, and it's a little faster. I'm not discrediting lawyers, they're amazing, but the information is already out there, right? But you do need to, as a member of a product team, be able to recognize when a technical choice gets in the way. You need to understand when there's legal risk, when it could create user harm, when there's accountability gaps, when there's documentation needs, when there's human oversight requirements, or when there's market constraints. Most of us are probably familiar with GDPR. Yeah, I'm going to say so. This is more for my US students. So there's a lot of jokes I could make that I'm not going to make here. But GDPR is still one of the strongest data protection laws globally. You should have an understanding of this as a developer, right? If you're building any sort of system that works with data, I'm going to bet that you are. You should have an understanding here. So the EU AI Act is now actively phasing in. So we have general provisions in AI literacy and prohibited practices and rules that began applying in 2025. General purpose AI, GPAI obligations then began applying from August 2025. And now most of the high risk obligations phase starting in August 2026, so upcoming, with some of the product safety related high risk obligations extending in through 2027. So basically what you have to know here is what your risk category is, because that is going to be relevant to you. So there's everything from a minimal risk system all the way up to prohibited practices. And it is very important for you as an engineer, as a product team member, to understand where your system fits within these categories. It's a lengthy read, the entire EU AI Act. I'm not telling you that you need to leave here and go read it and keep up with it, but it's really good to at least understand the categories and then understand where it applies to you. So just some key dates if you're not keeping an eye on this. I kind of mentioned this in the previous slide, but we started pulling in some stuff from 2025. August 2026 is going to be a really big marker. And then over the next year, we have some of the rest of it that's going to start coming in. The biggest takeaway here for you, classify your system early. Early would have been like a year ago, by the way, but if you haven't done it yet, do it now. Your risk category is going to affect your documentation. It's going to affect your testing. It's going to affect your oversight, your transparency requirements, and your launch readiness. So what's happening in the US? Well, it's an interesting time to be in the US and want AI governance. I will not get into the back and forth horrors that have occurred, mostly perpetuated by an orange thing in DC. But there's a big fight, a lot of politics happening around who owns AI governance. It's still hopefully being driven by the states. It's very fragmented, which makes it very complicated. A lot of corporations are looking to the EU for guidance, anticipating that hopefully someday we get to that place. There's some proposed frameworks that would disallow states to make and maintain their own regulations. So we're really hoping that one fails in court. The best resource that I like to use for tracking state regulations comes from the International Association of Privacy Professionals. They have a state AI governance legislation tracker that they update whenever it's needed, and you can go state by state and see what the latest is. So I use that as my kind of active source of truth. So what you should be learning to ask here is basically, what kind of AI system is this? What kind of data does it use? Who could be harmed? Does it influence a meaningful decision? Is a human in the loop, and do they have real authority? Could we explain, audit, and reverse what happened? And then what market, sector, or user group changes the risk classification? I'm going to fly through something here, but what you should know is one of the best frameworks out there is, anytime you hear RMF, by the way, that's Risk Management Framework, and there's a whole lot of different ones out there. My favorite comes from NIST. It's the US National Institute of Standards and Technology. They're still doing a lot of work. Their teams have been slashed in the last year, but they are still have some amazing people on site. They also have amazing frameworks around bias measurement and mitigation. But most RMFs are actually based off of NIST's framework. So what they do is they break it down. And basically what you do is you govern, right? So you want to set your policies and your rules. Who's responsible for risk and review? Then you map it. You need to understand your system's process, its users, what the potential harm is. And you measure. You gather your evidence, your metrics. Maybe it's fairness, maybe it's robustness, maybe it's those explainability metrics. And you manage. Take actions, right? Mitigate your risks. Document. I know as devs we hate documentation, but let me tell you how important it is when legal comes knocking on your door. Update. Governance. We have to keep it going. I am not going to go through all of this, but Microsoft's RAI standards and their RMF, it should look really familiar as I fly through here, because guess what? It's basically NIST's RMF, and they've adapted it to their own governance goals and actions. They've identified key values and what they're going to do for each of those key values. If you would like to learn more about Microsoft's approach, I do have a QR code here, and I believe that goes to their report from last year. Okay, I am going to give you the simplest framework to get you started, and it's just 4 questions. And this is what I do when I need to think about a complicated problem. First, I say, what do I need to do? What's the product or the goal? And then this is where I start asking myself, well, what should we do? All those ethics and values that came into play, I start deciding which ones are related here. What must we do? What are those legal or industry requirements? Then I start pulling in the constraints. What can we do? What are the technical or organizational constraints? And from there, we can get a decision. Now, I've made a couple different handouts sometimes where we can start from each of these big questions. There's a lot of sub-questions, right, where we can start looking at things like, in the what do we need to do, like what's the product or feature we're building, what decisions will it influence or automate, who are the end users, what's the intended benefits. We have similar ones with what should we do, basically what values or ethics or relevance, what's the best case scenario if we get it right, what's the worst case scenario if we get it wrong, how would we explain this to a decision maker? How do we explain this to a stakeholder? And at the end of this, we can come up with user stories, because we all know user stories. And I'm going to fly through this example here. And then we basically get the same thing with what must we do, what can we do. This is an iterative and ongoing practice. So my friend Swatasina, she always says we have to move from reactive to proactive governance. We have to keep this going. Also, this is a top-down and bottom-up approach. What do I mean by that? If you have only your dev and product teams doing this, but no one is supporting it from up top, it's going to fail. Likewise, if up top wants this, but they're not enabling support from your product teams, it's going to fail. You have to have support and value on both sides. You can create a RACI diagram. It works pretty well. My last little thing here, and I know I'm over time by about a minute. I often hear people talk about the future of AI like it's some, I don't know, like inevitable destination, right? It's like a promised land, some green pasture. We're going to wake up and have all these magical things, or the doomsday things too. But the truth is that it doesn't exist on either side. There's no guaranteed path where all of this just ends well by default or ends horrifically by default. We get there by taking incremental steps, by making choices, by building things like governance frameworks and thinking critically ourselves, not just using Chat or Gemini or whatever you're using today, right? Thinking critically about what we're doing and the impact it's going to have, not just today, but tomorrow. And so we could have a safe and fair and just AI future, but we're only going to get there if we build it deliberately and collectively. And so for that, we need a little bit more than ambition. We need tools and principles and practices. And if you would like, I have a reading list with some resources that will help you get started in this space, if this is new and interesting to you. And then if you want to connect with me, I'm hoping this works, that should go to my LinkedIn. If not, feel free to reach out and message me. I'm always happy to talk, always happy to help you with the problem that you're facing. I might tell you it depends, but we can figure it out together.